we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
For The World Today, this is James O'Neill. The United States and Iran have tentatively agreed to a 60-day memorandum of understanding extending their current ceasefire while negotiations continue over Iran's nuclear program. The proposed deal is awaiting final approval from President Trump. Although a ceasefire has been in place since April 7th, tensions remain high with recent exchanges of fire and U.S. accusations that Iran violated the ceasefire through drone and missile launches targeting the Strait of Hormuz and Kuwait. President Trump reiterated that Iran would not be allowed to retain highly enriched uranium and rejected proposals to transfer the material to China or Russia. Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu warned that Australia, Japan, and South Korea could eventually host U.S. nuclear weapons as part of America's expanding military strategy in the Asia-Pacific region. Shoigu cited possible deployments linked to upcoming U.S.-Japan military exercises and broader cooperation through the AUKUS partnership involving Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. He also warned against efforts to create a NATO-like alliance structure in Asia aimed at countering China and Russia. Moscow and Beijing have repeatedly criticized what they view as growing NATO influence and U.S. military expansion across Eurasia and the Pacific. 3 people were hospitalized after a knife attack near Winterthur railway station in Switzerland, where witnesses reported the suspect shouting Allahu Akbar during the incident. Police arrested a 31-year-old Swiss citizen of Turkish heritage and are investigating the attack as a suspected act of terrorism. Reports said the suspect was previously known to authorities for disseminating Islamic State propaganda and had connections to a mosque in Winterthur previously linked to Islamist extremism and foreign fighters traveling to Syria. Witnesses described chaotic scenes as bystanders and security personnel intervened to stop the attacker. Swiss authorities have not yet officially classified the incident as terrorism, and investigations into the suspect's motives and background are ongoing. Federal investigators accused former CIA official David Rush of stealing government assets, including 303 gold bars worth an estimated $40 million, $2 million in cash, and luxury Rolex watches allegedly claimed as work-related expenses. The FBI raided Russia's Virginia home after a CIA audit identified missing assets and referred the matter for criminal investigation. Rush has been charged with theft of public money and is also accused of falsifying large portions of his professional background, including claims about military service, academic credentials, and aviation experience. Reports further allege he improperly received military leave payments while working at the CIA. Rush remains in federal custody as the investigation continues. A jury in Southampton, England, convicted 23-year-old Vikram Digwa of murdering student Henry Novak after initially convincing police he had been the victim of a racist attack. Prosecutors said Digwa stabbed Novak multiple times following an argument in December of 2025, while Digwa's mother, Kiran Kaur, was convicted of helping hide the weapon. Body cam footage shown in court revealed police handcuffing the dying Novak after being falsely told he was the aggressor, despite his repeated claims that he had been stabbed. The U.S. Department of Justice has opened an investigation into writer E. Jean Carroll over whether she committed perjury during testimony related to her lawsuits against President Trump. Investigators are examining Carroll's 2022 testimony that her lawsuits had not received outside financial support, despite later disclosures that LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman helped cover some legal expenses.
Another thing that he and his lawyers have often spoken about is the lack of disclosure about a big Democratic donor funding part of this case. Was there a reason it wasn't disclosed, and did you view this as political in any way?
No. I just completely forgot that he even existed.
In your deposition?
Yes, in my deposition.
This has been James O'Neill for The World Today. Now the protagonists.
The conversation continues.
How ridiculously complicated they've tried to make this global warming argument.
Today's News Talk, The World Today.
And welcome to The World Today. I'm Mike Ryan. Just a bit, we're going to deviate off the panels for tonight. Instead of doing the protagonists, we'll be including some one-on-ones just to have a conversation with the guest and find out their thoughts and maybe where the world is heading. Our guest today is Colonel Grant Newsham, who's the author of the recent book, When China Attacks, A Warning to America. Now, Grant's a retired US Marine officer with decades of experience in the Indo-Pacific region, to include serving as Reserve Head of Intelligence for Marine Forces Pacific. He was the first Marine advisor to the Japan Self-Defense Force and helped create Japan's amphibious force. Mr. Newsham is an attorney with experience in international trade and international law. Now, there's a lot happening with the US foreign policy, where conflict abounds, to put it mildly. The US-China relationship has been very prickly, but did the recent summit achieve a pause or thaw in that relationship? Are the US and China friends or foes? And what can we expect from both, with the war in Iran and major shifts in the geopolitical landscape? First of all, Grant, thanks for joining me.
Sure, glad to be here.
Tell me, in a nutshell, friends or foes?
Well, you'd have to ask the Chinese, and actually they tell us about every day if you just read the Chinese press and listen to them. They're our enemy, or we are their enemy. They call us that, the main enemy. And if you read Xi Jinping's document 9, he gave that speech in about 2013. It was almost the same day the New York Times published an article saying he was going to liberalize the place once he got his footing. He basically says in document 9 that either the Chinese system is going to survive or the American system will survive, and it's not going to be the Americans who survive. So they see us as an enemy. They see the war has already started, and America's stretched out the open hand of friendship, sort of characterized by then Assistant Secretary of Defense Joseph Nye, an Ivy League professor, who says very clearly, well, back then our choice was, if we treat China like an enemy, it will become one. And so we're not going to do that. We're going to treat them like a friend. We're going to accommodate them with everything. And that's what we did. So basically, China is America's enemy, and that's up to them.
Mm. What was the objective of the summit?
Oh, it's a little hard to say. Some of us thought President Trump shouldn't have gone, but it's his nature to want to talk, and he's the president and we're not. So if he wants to go talk to the Chinese, that's what we do. And I think it was to size each other out, but the American perspective, at least, was to see what things looked like with a first-hand view of the Chinese, of Xi Jinping. Once President Trump gets in a room with somebody, he thinks, I suspect, that he can read them, understand their motivations, etc., and what might be possible. And if you're not talking, directly, you may not have the best sense of things. So I think that's his style. He's a New York real estate magnate, of course, and they talk. So he went, and they saw what they could say, saw what was available. And I don't think either side really saw much that they liked from this.
Mm. It was a bit of a jaunt too, wasn't it, for those with a few dollars to spare? Obviously, the trade was on the agenda for this, besides other things, of course. You're an expert, or you're very versed with international trade. What can we expect with international trade between the US and China?
Well, I wouldn't expect any improvements. The meetings are held, and there's always talk about China buying more American soybeans, buying Boeing jets, sort of buying more things from America to make the trade imbalance go down or maybe even equalize. But that really doesn't make any difference at the end of the day. China does those things sort of to humor the Americans, to give them the impression that there's some improvements in the offing. But what China would need to do, if there was going to be any real change on the trade front, it would need to first keep the promises it made when it was allowed into the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, stop stealing intellectual property, stop the cyber attacks on the United States. It actually has to stop funding state-owned corporations, state-owned enterprises in China that are clearly against its promises, what it said it would do. And so you have companies in China that really don't have to make a profit. They have unlimited capital, and they are out there really as weapons of the Chinese state. So it has to really keep some of the promises it made. And if you think about it, a little reciprocity would go a long way when a foreign company goes into China. The Chinese objective is to really loot it, take any technology from it, destroy it, and replace it with a Chinese company. And that is always the case. And Elon Musk is going to find out eventually that Tesla is no exception. So you really can't do business with a company, a country or a market like the one in the PRC. It's an abnormal economy. It has nothing to do with what we would consider a free, honest, open market. So really, it's a lost cause even to try to do this. So this talk of China buying more American stuff, that isn't really going to lead to anything, because in the bigger picture, the larger environment, you have a trading partner, trading adversary that is out to destroy you and is doing everything that it possibly can to achieve the end. So this really is a waste of time. If you've followed it for 40 years, you kind of figure something out. And the last thing I would note is that, Xi Jinping noted that China will be opening up, and they talk about, reform, etc. Well, the decades that I've been following this, every quarter China has announced that it's opening up. Well, when is it going to start, actually? And until you can get a contract enforced predictably in China, that forget about it. It's it is not a place where sensible people go to do business.
Yeah, interesting. It's coming soon. Soon. Just wait.
Yeah, this time. Yeah. Swear to God. Yeah.
But the Chinese play the long game, of course, and this one is a very long game. We may not see the end of it or the start of the game. Sorry?
Oh, well, they understand us. They do a good job. They know that certainly the Americans, Westerners, always think there's hope that this time it's going to work. And they string us out, and they understand the American psyche extremely well. And you play to the greed, the vanity, this optimism that any problem with anybody can be worked out if we just talk, give it a little time. And you've got to hand it to them. Sometimes you do step back in awe of what they have managed to accomplish without a currency that is convertible, which means nobody much wants it. And they've really done a very good job in that respect, although over 600 million Chinese still live on $5 a day or less. So how much of a success has it really been is open to debate.
So they understand us. We keep going back. Do we understand them?
We should. I think the ones of us who do and have for a long time have not been particularly well treated. I think there's more people who are aware of the China threat now than there ever has been. But if you look at Wall Street, look at America's business class, there's this sort of hope springing eternal that this time you're going to make some money in the China market. And it really hasn't panned out at all. So I'm not quite sure that we do understand them as well as we should. And there's something about Capitol Hill in Washington that could practically make the Earth stop rotating on its axis. It's when it comes to dealing with China, getting tough with China. And I would point to one data point in particular, and I always do, is that it's fentanyl. That has killed well over 800,000 Americans since about 2013. All of it comes from China. China could stop it in an afternoon if it wanted. And what has the punishment been for China for killing this many Americans? Nothing. And that's on Capitol Hill, even though there's plenty of people who are rightly incensed about it, understand where the problem comes from, but they just can't do anything. So I'm not all that optimistic yet about our willingness and our ability, really, to understand the China threat and do something about it. You'll meet plenty of very good people on Capitol Hill, both congressmen, senators, and their staff members. But as I said, there's something there that ultimately you just get the sense the donor class, the people who contribute to the politicians, that they call the shots and they can make any proper sort of recompense just make it impossible. So China does what it wants, and we have not really gone about defending ourselves.
Just put yourself, I just want to get your views because you know China particularly well, you know this topic very well. If you were in the shoes, if you were looking from their perspective, for example, what would you be expecting from the West?
Well, I'd say continued gullibility. It seems like the Europeans are pretty much sort of limitless in that part of it, where they're turning over their industries to the PRC. The Germans are an excellent case study. Once this really economic powerhouse, manufacturing powerhouse, and they have gotten in bed with the Chinese, and nothing good happens from that. So I think there's a hope that the U.S. will continue, not just the U.S., but the free nations will continue to support the Chinese economy. And I think they have some real concerns now, because you're seeing that foreign direct investment, which is foreign companies investing directly into China, that is way down over what it was just a few years ago. And I mean way down, perhaps almost to zero. And you also have capital flow out of China, most of it sort of by illicit means. That too has never been bigger than it is now, which means that people in China at all levels don't have enough confidence in the future to keep their money there. So they face some real problems if the West does not continue pouring money into China and technology as well. So they're hoping that what has been happening, they hope it continues, but not the recent things that they're seeing. And there's more moves afoot than there's ever been to restrict the export of technology to China. And they don't like that. Xi Jinping says it. He doesn't like trade blocks being formed, which means their targets defending themselves together. He doesn't like trade weaponized. He talks about all these things, and when he tells you what they don't like, well, you should be doing more of it. So I think they're pretty concerned. And you also look at what President Trump has done in recent months to almost get a handle over much of the global energy supplies. That they don't like this as well, because China is heavily dependent on energy imports, and most of that comes from the Middle East. And that causes them some real concern, because they did get used to getting pretty much free energy from Iran and Venezuela for a long time, and now that's been choked off a bit. So I wouldn't want to be in the position of having to run China's economy. There's no sort of magical Oriental wisdom of the Orient that they've figured out that allows them to run an economy in some way that nobody's figured out in 5,000 years. They have all the problems that anyone faces. And as noted, when 600 million plus of your own people are only living on $5 a day, well, that's the reality. It's not the shiny cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen and the sort of the manufacturing successes, which the Chinese do have, but rather it's a place with a lot of problems, and you choke off that flow of technology and foreign currency in particular and make it harder for them to export. Because if you export, then you earn real money. You earn the dollars that you need, say, to buy Australian iron ore, to make the steel that you need to make cars or to make your Navy as well. And if that gets choked off, then you've got some real problems. Now, try paying for it in RMB, in the Chinese currency. And nobody much wants that, but the dollar is still the king. And without it, well, I'm not sure China has even half the foreign exchange that it needs to pay for everything that it needs to pay for in dollars overseas. And you find Ivy League professors require payment in US dollars as well, just as much as Australian iron ore suppliers do as well. So the expression "fake it till you make it," I think it applies pretty well to the Chinese communists when it comes to running their economy.
Should we trust the Chinese?
Well, I don't know why you would. Where's the empirical evidence for that? You'd be hard pressed to name an agreement that they have not violated. Just go back to the World Trade Organization promises. And so the Chinese don't even trust themselves. I mean, if you've done business there and you're familiar with the country, that there isn't any great sort of basic trust in even just other Chinese people. And in business, you can expect to get cheated. Even if it's Chinese on Chinese, and the Shanghainese in particular are famous for this. And it's part of the game. And to expect to sort of extrapolate or put the sort of a Western sort of standard on things and think that that's going to apply in China, I think that is a fool's errand. And you think people would know by now. And I've mentioned before that I used to work for Motorola. And we were encouraged to go into China right after Tiananmen Square. And the idea was that, well, the Chinese would be so happy to sort of buy it, to have good jobs, and Motorola setting up factories in China, sharing technology, and what they're not sharing is getting stolen. And what happened was, within a few years, that we built our competitors, and they ultimately put Motorola out of business. There were a few other things that happened But that was all done with a sense that, well, we were in the good graces of the Chinese Communist Party, and that they would, give us free. We would be allowed to operate the way we would, say, in Illinois. Well, all that was doing really was committing suicide. And as I said, you name a company that has succeeded over the long run in China, it's a very short list. And even Mr. Musk is going to find out that it's not going to have a happy ending for him either.
Should the Chinese trust the West?
Well, I would. Look at how many decades we spent accommodating the PRC. I cited Joseph Nye's basic approach to dealing with the PRC, and that's really what the U.S. did for many years. They accommodated everything that the PRC did that we didn't like. And I remember once asking it was a general at old PACOM, or U.S. Indo-Pacific in Hawaii, and I asked him, well, why are you guys appeasing China? And I used that word, and he said, well, what else are we supposed to do? Go to war with them? Well, I could think of a few things in between appeasement and thermonuclear war. But that was the thinking very much, is that we can't challenge them. They just don't understand what the rules of the game are. And as soon as they do, they'll liberalize. They'll become a responsible stakeholder in the international sort of system. And that was the thinking very much. So certainly I would suggest that 30, 40, 50 years even of accommodating and sort of letting the Chinese figure out their own way to liberalize, that's a pretty good sort of demonstration of at least the trust or the willingness to accommodate that the Chinese have experienced and benefited from. And what has been the result of it? They've said, thank you very much. They pocketed the benefits and built up a military that in some circumstances could defeat the U.S. forces. It's more than a match for any other Asian force one-on-one. They have an economy that is a global powerhouse by any measure, despite all its problems. And that is really demonstrated that we've trusted them. Well, they've been glad to have us trust them, and at the same time do everything they can to basically put us in a very bad position, if not destroy us. And the list of companies that have experienced the outcome of what comes of trusting, of letting, trusting China. Start with Northern Telecom, once Canada's biggest company, most prominent one. Well, the Chinese put that one out of business and put a stake through its heart. And just go down the list. There's a reason why Microsoft doesn't do much business in China. Google as well dropped out. And even Starbucks and McDonald's. They've all trusted the Chinese and been very accommodating and trustworthy, and look what happens to them. So I don't see the empirical evidence for that. And I would like to see some CEO of a major company or even a smaller company stand in front of the shareholders or even stand in front of the regulators and explain why going into the China market is actually a sort of a sensible sort of protection or use of shareholder assets and shareholder value. I think that'd be a hard case to make, given, as I said, decades of empirical evidence here. One hesitates to be unremittingly negative, but I'm not quite sure where the positive element of all of this is.
And I've just talked about the West, which includes Australia or the other countries of similar ilk. However, they are doing business with China. But next question is then, you say they can trust the West. Can they trust Donald Trump? And if you've just mentioned that Donald Trump or the US is trying to create a stress on the fuel supply or the oil supply to China, Venezuela and such. And then we have a company, TikTok, which is a Chinese company. Now it's been run by Oracle. Oracle are very strong with Israel. And I still believe that China I think they have 13% share in TikTok. So there's a couple of examples why China shouldn't trust the US or Donald Trump. Donald Trump is first of all a commercial beast, a real estate beast at the start. That's his background, dealing with real estate and very big buildings and very cutthroat. Do you think his background suits diplomacy? It would seem not.
Oh, I'd say actually his background is probably the best of any president we've we've had in modern times, because he's in that business. He's been used to dealing with unsavory people, from corrupt local governments, corrupt labor unions, and corrupt politicians. He's really had some very good experience at that. I can't think of another president who's actually had that. One does hear, of course, that, well, I think we're seeing Trump derangement syndrome on display. He's from New York. He has a character of a New Yorker, at least as I would see it. But he's also been very effective. He was the first president, particularly during the Trump first term, the first president that I'm aware of, and I've been following them since probably before Gerald Ford, the first one to stand up to China, to actually stand up for U.S. interests. The Chinese hated him, and they hated his team in particular, were guys who had sized up the PRC. This was Matt Pottinger, Miles Yu, Dave Stilwell, Mike Pompeo, and the Chinese hated them because they were effective. And it was the first one to do this was a real estate magnate from Queens. It was no other president. All the others really rolled over, not entirely. But they didn't do what he did. And I would note also that the Biden administration did some things that were very good at getting tough on the PRC, particularly on the trade front. So it isn't as if Mr. President Trump is the only one who's caused the Chinese some concern. And he's often criticized for being transactional, as if that's an insult. Well, one would hope that a president is transactional in the sense that we're getting something out of what we do, either for our allies or for our enemies. One wants the Americans to benefit from that. And I think that most Americans would agree with that, certainly Americans in flyover country who provide the cannon fodder, who provide the troops, the people that join the military. Well, they would like to think that America's getting something out of this, whatever we do on the foreign affairs front. And President Trump is a tough negotiator. He's hard to figure out. Even, we have a hard time following him. And if you sort of pay too much attention to what he actually says versus what he does, well, that's very difficult. You can sort of give you whiplash and make you a little bit nauseated just for what you call motion sickness. But say, look at what he does. And if the alternative really is some of the previous presidents, say like Bill Clinton, for example, George Bush #1, even George Bush #2, the ones who were nice and who were I don't know what you would call it, but played the game and did everything possible not to antagonize China nor to antagonize our European allies. But they were very presidential in that regard. They did exactly what the foreign policy elites told them to do. And what did the U.S. get out of it? And you will find that many Americans are not very impressed with what they saw. So I think a lot of the criticism of President Trump, and I gather that in Australia the TDS is raging. One has to ask, well, what is the alternative? And also, what is the performance of previous presidents here that allowed China to build up, as I said, to a force that if they chose their spots, they could probably defeat us in a certain type of fight in the Western Pacific, and that really allowed large parts of the United States to be just cleaned out in terms of manufacturing capabilities, and that's the jobs, the neighborhoods that existed for decades, if not longer. And those were cleaned out, and now if you go through them, it looks like a war has hit them, and they're just filled with drug-addled zombies. And that was what we got from the previous successive administrations. Well, that was not a very good outcome from all of this. And President Trump is, I think a lot of people would say he's standing up for the U.S. and it's the first one to do it when it comes to the PRC. And I mentioned our European allies as well. Well, they used to laugh at every other administration that told them you'd better take care of your own interests because we're not going to pay the freight the way we have been. And all other administrations asked the same things of the Europeans, but it took some tough love to actually start getting some results. So the one really has to step back, I think, when it comes to considering President Trump and actually look at what he's dealing with and what he has accomplished so far, and look at what his predecessors accomplished. Yes, there was a lot of back patting by our perfumed elites, the pedigreed elites that have run things, and I'm not so sure. Well, I am sure they didn't accomplish very much at all. If one doesn't believe me, go to Philadelphia, go to Baltimore, and take a look at it and see what these places look like. And they didn't have to happen. So,
It would seem, or some would say, that if you have a platoon of soldiers marching and there's one out of step, and you might have, say, 40, even say just a small platoon, and they're marching away, and in that 50 or 60, there's one out of step, and the mother of that soldier, because they're on parade, says, "Look at my son; he's the only one in step." It would seem that this could also be applied to the diplomacy tactics from the US, in particular Donald Trump. If you look at the rest of the West, from the UK down to Australia and in between, they are marching to their beat, and the US is not in step. What do you say to that?
well, if you look at who contributes what to all of this, and take the U.S. just take them out of the equation. Would the Europeans be able to stand up to the Russians? They can't even stand up to immigrants coming over in rubber boats from France. So probably not. Australia, well, how would it fare one-on-one against the PRC? Well, when the Chinese call you the gum that sticks to the sole of your shoe, I think, and you've only got 11 ships in your navy, and you have a military that's much too small, doesn't really know what it's supposed to do, despite there's the immense professionalism, that it's not clear exactly how well any of these countries would do without the U.S. backstopping them. And the U.S. has effectively funded global stability for decades. And if you put a figure on that, it would be in the many, many, many trillions of dollars. And this has been based on the assumption that the U.S. will send its young people wherever it has to be to die on behalf of people who can't be bothered to spend enough on defense or to join their own militaries in enough numbers to actually die instead of us. And that was a game that could play for as long as it worked. And what was that called? The international order, the established order, whatever it was called, the rules-based order. Well, that was I think not a fluke, but it was a short-term thing, and really dependent on American dominance, American ability to actually underwrite the global security. And now that somebody has come along and is pointing this out, that nobody likes it. Nobody likes being called a deadbeat and to say, well, look, you haven't been doing what you need to do. And if you were to go and make that case, I recommend it really, that the Australian ambassador and every European ambassador ought to go to places like Youngstown, Ohio, Wichita, Kansas, and speak to the Rotary clubs and explain to them why they just can't spend more on defense. They can't have more effective defense or have larger militaries because they just can't do it. It's not comfortable. They don't have the money. They have to fund whatever it is. But we expect your young children to come die for us. Well, that's not a vote getter. And it's something that finally, I think the bulk of the Americans in the flyover country finally realized that the so-called foreign policy elite kind of didn't know what it was doing and has always been very willing to really expend sort of American lives to really test out their Ivy League theories. It sounds crass and a little glib, but I think that is how it often is regarded, and I dealt with these people a lot, and both in the government and also the business class. And I would say that there really is a contempt, or at least a lack of consideration, for the citizens who actually die to carry out American foreign policy or go serve. So this was something that couldn't last forever. And obviously the first person who tells the 35-year-old living in your basement and getting an allowance every month, look, you're going to have to go get a job. Well, he's not going to be very popular. And this is, how I would see it. And say if the ambassadors ought to get out into the rest of America, outside the Beltway in Washington, and make their case if they think that they're being treated unfairly. You'll certainly get a fair hearing there, but I'm not sure I would be the one I would care to make those speeches out there. And I think people would be left a little bit irked. And I'd go speak to not just the Rotary clubs, the parent teachers associations at the high schools where people join and say, well, your kids ought to go die, not ours. It's not an easy argument to make. And it's an epochal shift I think we're seeing in the world where basically our entire lives, it seemed like the United States, was big enough, powerful enough to underwrite security and also absorb a fair amount of unfairness in the global trading system that everybody benefited from. But we just can't do that anymore, and I think we're seeing that shift. And also, we've unfortunately we've got some bad guys who come back, and now we do face some real threats from the Chinese, the Russians, and particularly to the extent they combine. That is a huge problem. So we're just watching history being made, sort of as we exist and as we're living. And it's, one, like me, I like reading about chaos and wars, but I prefer when it's happening to someone else or 200 years ago, not so much today.
Yeah, there's something you said about wearing a aluminium or aluminum hat, just in case there's someone lets off something rather large next door. Can you just tell me, I'm quite interested in your thoughts. I saw a clip from Tucker Carlson the other day with another guy talking about how they had this support for Donald Trump, and that their support was very strong, and blah 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 blah, and that they supported him because he was going to put America first. And it would seem now that they haven't put America first, or he hasn't put America first, and therefore they're quite disenchanted and disillusioned with the direction of the US. And if you look at and again I go back to the diplomacy, it would sometimes resemble that of a schoolyard bully, and that is what they're saying. And the support for Israel is of concern to these people that have doubted Donald Trump's commitment to America first, and he's at times, it's been said by many, and I would probably agree to an extent, that he's also putting Israel first. And there's been other fraudulent slips from other political leaders within the Trump administration, and it would seem that what Tucker Carlson is illuminating is quite true, that Donald Trump is not putting America first. He is putting, in many cases, Israel first. And you look at videos and interviews with Tolstein and a whole bunch of them, you'd have to be, they would say in Australia, you'd have to be blind Freddy not to see the obvious truth.
Oh, I would see that very differently, actually. You could take Israel out of the picture, just remove it completely, and the U.S. would have to do the same thing it's doing with Iran. You would have to do it. Any responsible president would. In fact, every president before Mr. Trump said they would. They said Iran would not get nuclear weapons. None of them did anything about it. They kicked the can down the road, and in some cases, they actually backed the Iranians. The Obama and Biden administrations, gave the Iranians billions of dollars and stood by while the Iranians funded terrorism, destabilized the region, and actually sent their hit squads out to kill President Trump, Mike Pompeo, and others. So President Trump's the one who's actually done what every other president said they would. And as I said, you could take Israel out of the picture, and we have to do the same thing. As for the Tucker Carlsons, these guys are off their rockers. And in Tucker Carlson's case, you'd probably have to sort of ask him, where his money comes from. It does seem he has some connections with Middle East cash. But there's a sort of a ballpark of discourse, political discourse in the U.S., and Tucker Carlson is well outside of that. And there's a sort of a nasty sort of anti-Semitism to all of this. That is just dressed up better than it was 100, 200 years ago, or even farther. So I really think that these guys are kind of weird, actually. And to try and get in and debate them is just wrong. But in terms of us or President Trump being led around by the Israelis, I've been hearing, you heard that about George Bush, you've heard about it almost every administration. And it's, as I say, this is, think of the pogroms that go back thousands of years. This is just some manifestation of it. I don't see the evidence of that. We should be darn glad the Israelis are actually, there to help us with this. But, I've heard this, and it's, I don't see the evidence for it at all. So it's really, to get in with, but the Tucker Carlson business, I've followed him for years, and for a long time thought he, was an interesting guy to watch, made some sense, and he's sort of gone off his rocker. Reminds me a little bit of some of these nuts my parents used to invite over to Thanksgiving dinner, who once they would get started about whatever it was, the Trilateral Commission, or even UFOs, But that's how bad it is. So regarding him as a sort of a legitimate bellwether, or even sort of reference point of what's going on, I think is probably sort of mistaken.
We had last night on the protagonist, we had Professor Emeritus Professor Joseph Siracusa, who's written 47 books and a very, very well-respected, well-credentialed political analyst from around the world. And being from Chicago, he has a particular take on things. And one of those is that he described the Trump administration as being akin to a protection racket. And he said, if he doesn't like you, you're out. And if he likes you, he'll look after you. And cutting out all the other bits and pieces of it, but getting down to Donald Trump seems to be a president that if he likes you, you're okay. And if he doesn't like you, you've got a few problems. What would make Donald Trump not like you?
I don't know. I'm not sure anybody quite knows, but I would ask, is he any different than any other president? If you got into the sort of the president's universe and you said things he didn't like, didn't agree with, he saw you as somebody who was trying to undercut him. Well, he wouldn't be long for that job. And President Trump is not the first president like this. In fact, in business, it's like this as well. And you get up into the executive ranks. If you get a reputation as a gadfly or someone who causes problems, or even they just don't like you, that you're gone. So the idea that President Trump is somehow uniquely unpleasant or uniquely call it antisocial, I'm just not buying that at all. And if you just read a bit about any other president, and if you remember them, that there were always people who ran afoul of them and were not long for the position. I think one thing about President Trump is that we sort of almost have a window into his real-time thinking, and that's never been the case with another president. He says what he thinks, and he's very open to the press. He's not controlled so much in how, what public access there is to his thinking, to his actions. And that's the first time. We haven't had this for an awfully long time. In fact, I don't ever remember it. And there is just this sense that he is just uniquely evil, uniquely problematic, which I'm just not buying it at all. They said the same thing about George Bush #2, that if you remember that the term Bush derangement syndrome was actually coined by Charles Krauthammer, the commentator, regarding the second George Bush. And also remember that the hatred, the venom that was directed towards Ronald Reagan, said all sorts of nasty things about him. And they say this really is nothing new, but for whatever it is, President Trump brings out the worst in these people. A protection racket. I don't know if he is any. I think that's stating it a little too much. I'm not quite sure the context in which it was said, but as I said, it's no different in government or in business. If you're going to get up into sort of the top management circles, that you can run afoul of somebody of importance, for you don't quite know why sometimes. But you do have to be seen as somewhat loyal. That's always a good thing. And particularly after the first Trump administration, when he was sort of top advisors and top officials had people who were out to actually undermine him, that he's, I think, understandably a little gun shy about it. But, it's, say I'm from Virginia, so it's President Trump's a New Yorker, and I'm not sure I'd fit in very well in a New York environment, but that's, so say there's a sense that somehow he is the weirdest, the worst guy to come along ever. All I'd say is just wait for the next Republican president, and you'll get another version of derangement syndrome. So I just don't see the evidence for all of that. And if it's the ideas we're shaking down our friends, say the Europeans, to defend themselves, once again, go to where most of American youth come from that join the military. Ask their parents, should America be strong-arming its so-called allies to actually do the fighting themselves? Well, the answer would probably be yes. But I've lived long enough, and you realize that there isn't anything all that unusual about Mr. Trump, except that we get a clearer view of his thinking. In fact, read a little bit about Harry Truman. what he would say in private, his language, etc. And there was nothing really sort of dignified about it. He was very clear, plain spoken. Lyndon Johnson was as crass and vulgar as they come. John F. Kennedy's behavior is well known. Reagan is actually thought of pretty well. So it's I think it's a hard case to make that President Trump is Lucifer incarnate.
I think they've got to have a target, and President Trump being president is the target. And some won't like it, some will like it, as you have alluded to. Tell me about because we see this this president who said they were, let me read here, they were never ending, they were endless wars, and the endless wars were wrong. Many are expecting, and that the war in Iran could go on for quite some time. And if Israel has its choice, it will go on for quite some time. We have, if you look at Venezuela, Middle East, and other parts of the world, we won't include Cuba there at this stage. You think a great determination here from Trump is to create a oil drought basically for China, and then basically have control on what China does next?
Oh, I don't. That may be a sort of an outcome of it, but I think you would have to do the same things once again, even if there was no China, with Iran. And Iran with nuclear weapons is something that we simply cannot abide. And if it takes some fighting to reach that end, well, it's part of the game. It's just the reality of foreign affairs for a great nation, and inconsistency is going to be a permanent part of that. Venezuela as well. The Venezuelans and the Cubans destabilizing the region mightily, pouring drugs into the United States behind the immigration rampage into the U.S. that the Biden administration aided and abetted as part of a political strategy. But you also they found the Russians using Venezuela and Cuba as intelligence surveillance platforms, also as subversion platforms for the region, but also with a little imagination. You put a half dozen missiles, say launched from down that way into the Houston oil facilities, and we have got some very serious problems. So potentially as a platform for kinetic actions. And the Chinese, of course, have been using Cuba and Venezuela for decades for that purpose. So someone had to go after that. Once again, it was the real estate magnate from Queens who was the first one to do what everyone else sort of talked about. And it just happens that, of course, that if Venezuelans are providing China with free oil, basically, and we've now got a handle on that, well, that works to our advantage. And the same goes with Iran and the Middle East as well. And it's a necessary thing for a president to do and to want to do, particularly the way the Chinese have used the rare earth stranglehold to really bring President Trump's efforts to crack down on things like fentanyl to a screeching halt. The Chinese had never played that card, but they very successfully built up the stranglehold on both extraction, mining, and processing of these rare earths. And as soon as they said, well, you're not getting any more, you had the heads of major U.S. companies coming to the White House and saying, we're going to have to shut down in a few weeks. So in some respects, it's not in some respects, I say in every respect, it's understandable that we would want to have some sort of leverage over the PRC when it comes to this. It's really sharp-elbowed international relations, and in this case, with a country that's avowed objective is to destroy us, or at minimum dominate us. And it's hard to imagine what else a responsible president would do. But there's more going on here than just taking it to the Chinese. But it is really an effort to really defend the hemisphere, but also defend the U.S. period. And that's where, once again, Iran comes into the picture, that somebody needed to do something about it. And a lot of us are glad President Trump did it. After 40 years of watching this regime take it out of the picture, you might have some hope of some stability in the Middle East, finally.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that the Iran building their nuclear weapons, former U.S. Director and National Intelligence head Tulsi Gabbard testified that the U.S. intelligence agencies assessed Iran was not building a nuclear weapon. So if Tulsi Gabbard has said they're not building a nuclear weapon, you'd have to assume that, and correct me if I'm wrong, assume that Israel said this. Why would their determination that Iran is building a nuclear weapon and your US National Director of National Intelligence said otherwise?
Well, Tulsi Gabbard's always, I kind of like her in some respects, but she was always a questionable choice in that position. Keep in mind, she also said that the Japanese pose an immense military threat to the region, not just to China, but to the region. And that suggests that she perhaps hasn't done her homework. She was, of course, the DNI. But I think the evidence is pretty clear that that the Iranians have nuclear weapons as an objective, and that they've come a very, very long way towards that end. I've heard many times over the years these assertions that they are not. But once again, look at the evidence, look at the centrifuges, look at the information that the Israelis spirited out of Iran, thank goodness. And getting a nuclear weapon has actually been Iran's objective since the Shah's day. This is nothing new. But I think the evidence, at least from my perspective, and I used to do a little bit work in this area, is that the fear is great, and it isn't something that, the Israelis have hoodwinked us into this. So you can take them out of the picture, and there's enough evidence that the threat of nuclear weapons from Iran is such that it needed to be acted on. And as I said, Tulsi Gabbard has had some advisors around her who are, I mentioned those people my parents used to invite over to Thanksgiving dinner, and one wonders exactly how they got hired into those positions. So that would be how I look at it.
So what you're saying,
here we are.
what you're saying, Grant, is that your former, but she was the US Director of National Intelligence, and all the information she received was incorrect. Doesn't that sound alarm bells, though, for the US? Either you have a very inefficient, inept department that's very, very important in determining who's a threat and who's not a threat, or you have a determination that we're going to go with Israel because they said so. It just doesn't, we would say it doesn't pass the pub test. Because Tulsi Gabbard, she's not just coming out and saying, well, they're not a threat. What she's saying is that all her officers and those below her have compiled the information that's required to come to that determination that Iran are not building a nuclear bomb and are not an imminent threat. Yet you have Israel, who it's well known, it's very obvious that Israel would like Iran just to disappear down a volcano. So perhaps there's the propensity to lean towards Israel and to ignore your own US Director of National Intelligence and the organisation itself should be sounding these huge alarm bells.
Well, once again, Tulsi Gabbard, as I said, was a problematic choice for this position.
Why?
And she's the one who went to Syria and said Assad's a great guy. You look at her background, and she hasn't done her homework. She's always been a sort of an ideologue when it comes to certain ideas, and it's not as if she, it's what you described sounds very reasonable. Is you think that all the information comes into the system, it gets filtered through, and she sees it all. I'm not convinced that's the case, and the whole office of ODNI probably shouldn't even exist. It was an add-on after 9/11 to try and make Congress feel better about things. But as I said, I'm not convinced that her statements are the case, and I'm just not. And the intelligence community itself, I'm not sure we get $100 billion worth out of it. But I think we know enough about what the Iranians are doing, what they have been doing, to have some justifiable concerns. And if you look exactly at what he said, she hasn't put it in the language that you've put it as well. It's, as I said, I am satisfied that the Iranians were going after nuclear weapons, still are. And look at what they say, look at their behavior. You know that as soon as we let the pressure up, they're going to go back on it. And we don't even, I have a feeling that we don't know everything that they're actually doing. as well, because our intelligence isn't always all that great, but we certainly know enough about it. And once again, putting the blame onto the Israelis. Well, it's once again, this is just saying, well, the Jews, these awful Jews, have put us into this problem, this fix. There's something to me that is very distasteful about that. But if you follow this case for 47 years, like I have, and know something of this business, know something of the Iranians, and also of the more recent state of the intelligence community. And it's not quite as clear-cut as one would think. Additionally, recall the problems with even saying where COVID came from. You couldn't even say that it might have come out of a Chinese lab. And it was said, well, that's what the intelligence community said. Well, no, that's what some people in the intelligence community said. And so we've got some problems with our intelligence community and the politicization of it that do need to be addressed. And unfortunately, I would say that the new head of the CIA, Ratcliffe, seems more interested in his next position rather than actually cleaning house. But when it comes to the Iranians, well, you can see what I think about it.
By the way, to criticise the Israeli government doesn't mean that anyone's anti-Semitic at all. And if they criticise the American government, the Australian government, doesn't mean that they dislike or hate immensely the Australians or the Brits or the Americans. So that's a common argument, that if you criticise Netanyahu and his agenda, that you are anti-Semitic, and that is just so wrong. But can you tell me, though, because we are running out of time, and by the way, I'm enjoying this conversation far too much. I think this is absolutely fascinating. Tell me, do you think, as a Marine, as an intelligence officer, where do you see, or how long do you see the conflict in the Middle East going with Iran? Does it stop? Because at the moment, it's decimating economies around the world. And you can't blame Iran for that, because America went in there in the first place and bombed the crap out of them.
Well, if say a nuclear weapon, say put it into a shipping container, goes off in, say, Hoboken or Bayonne, New Jersey.
They didn't do that.
Well,
the fact.
No, but that could be on the menu. That's going to cost a lot more. Go ahead.
No, but we don't know that. So I'm just saying, how long do you think this war will go on for? Because there's not much.
Well, what I was getting at was the idea that somehow we just sort of packed up one day and said, let's attack Iran. That there's some reasons for doing this. It's the sort of the less bad choice of a couple choices. I think it could, there's some curious things going on here. And the short answer is nobody quite knows. I would say that within a couple months, we should have a resolution, perhaps sooner than this. I think that there's some curious things. The 2-week ceasefire kind of made sense, because you have to catch your breath, let the pilots get some rest, restock, and then go back to work. But I think what that has done, and now it's a 6-week ceasefire, may go longer. Well, what that does is it lets the other guys catch their breath. And that was probably a mistake, I think, in not going after the Iranian communications networks, the transportation, their energy supplies, or even their oil export facilities. I think that was a curious decision. I'm not the guy who makes those decisions, but I would have perhaps done it differently and hit harder, and I wouldn't have stopped so that we could talk, and letting the Pakistanis, these Chinese cat's paws, sort of be the go-between, thinking they're going to do us a favor, particularly after the double dealing that they performed in the whole time we were in Afghanistan, backing the Taliban and killing Americans. I don't know why we would do that. And so there's some curious things that are being done, but I think that it can't go on that much longer. But if the cost of all of this, if keeping Iran from having nuclear weapons and having some shot at sort of a peace in the middle, or stable Middle East, if the cost of that was this fight against Iran, and in our case, say, gasoline costing $1.50 more, I would say that's worth it. One sometimes wonder how our parents actually withstood World War II, where you'd get 5,000 men dead in an afternoon, and the vicissitudes of that war, and having gone through the Depression before that. And here the price of gasoline goes up, and American hair goes on fire, supposed to go on fire. I understand the problems, and particularly things like agricultural inputs, that this is a real difficulty. But once again, you look at what the alternatives are, and it's it's a tough choice, and it's about time somebody did something about the Iranians. I'm a little concerned we're going to cut a deal where we get what looks good on paper, but sort of leaves that regime intact, and that's how I would look at it. And having seen the videos of what they did to William Buckley after they kidnapped him in Lebanon, that they sent back to the U.S., these are the kind of people we're dealing with. So and I think the president knows that, but how you actually resolve this, he's the man in the ring, and it's not easy at all.
It's interesting, America first, and at the moment, it would seem, though, that Donald Trump's got his finger in many, many pies. In fact, he said that if he was to run for Prime Minister of Israel, he would win hands down. And that's very odd when it comes from the President of the United States, but they are partners in many areas, and the Jewish lobby is not to be underestimated. Can you tell me, because other countries don't feel as warm and fuzzy towards this Iran conflict. If you look at Australia, we have businesses going belly up. We have, and it's partly due to our government, by the way. So I'm not letting them off the loose by any stretch. But we have many economies around the world because of the oil crisis, because of what oil makes and what it does, and the petroleum products there for whether it's fertilizer to plastics. All those things are in great jeopardy, and if we keep going in Australia this way, we're going to have major problems. We're going to have our economy basically will go belly up, along with other economies. So if you're looking at the attack on Iran to stop the nuclear proliferation from that terrible regime, we're doing that on one area. We're doing that on one piece of information, or the information from Mossad, from the Israelis. And your National Director of Intelligence says otherwise. And even though you don't like her, she didn't come out and say that. Her whole department have come to that conclusion. So, is it worth attacking? And you're saying to protect the world from the nuclear proliferation of Iran, and your Director of National Intelligence says otherwise. Was it worth? Were there other ways of diplomacy here? Were there other ways of not getting to the situation where we're all looking at a recession? Some are saying that if it keeps going the way it is, because of what we rely on and the complexities of the 21st century, we have a problem, though, because it's more complex. It's a lot more complex than it used to be. And if we go down the path of hitting a depression, and at the moment, no one knows when the war's going to finish and where it will head off to. You have the Gulf states saying, we're just about done with this. And then all of a sudden, they control more than just what Iran does when it comes, and those going through the Straits of Hormuz. Was it worth believing a piece of intelligence that many are saying was flawed from the first place?
With this, you've got to go back once again and say, do some real research into this, into this issue. And maybe you have, but I'd suggest doing some more about this, because it is not as clear cut as you say. The Jewish lobby that was referenced, well, there's probably 500 lobbies in the United States. The idea that somehow it has inordinate influence in the U.S., that's just wrong. But I hear it all the time, and it really tracks back to this idea that the Jews are bad, and that bleed over from sort of criticizing Israel into anti-Semitism. I think it happens far too often. But is this worth it? We're reminded a little bit of say when you just go on a family trip, and you just leave the driveway, and the kids in the back seat say, "Are we there yet?" This fight has been going on for how long now? 2.5 months. That isn't very long at all. And yes, it's once you start these fights, and they never quite end the way the way that you think they should. But we're not even, this is not a problem yet. What have the casualties been? 13 dead? And even the civilian casualties in Iran are incredibly light, given what targets have been hit. Yes, these 13, each of these is an individual tragedy, but this is it really has been a very well done fight. I think I would have done things a little differently, but we have to see how this plays out. In the Gulf states, well, they stuck their necks out, I think, expecting that the regime would get finished off. So I think that they have an interest in this very much, and they've been, as they are, they're not quite as sort of clear cut about it, although UAE has been pretty straightforward. But they often kind of say, well, we don't want war, etc. But secretly, they hope that we can finish them off. And whether the president can pull this off, does remind you of one of these sort of Chinese acrobats with dishes spinning. He's got a lot of things going on at the same time. And I think he expected a little more help from the civilized nations, particularly the Europeans, and that would both politically, but also sending some ships, say, to the Persian Gulf. He didn't expect them to be willing to allow this regime to continue just because it would make Donald Trump look bad. So you say they never quite go the way you think they are, and this is no exception. But we're not at a point where it's time to panic yet. And when it comes to, say, in Australia, what does it have, like 3 hours worth of fuel storage? I'm being a little funny, but it's just a matter of weeks. Well, it's not leprechauns that did that. That was government decisions to say that we're not going to actually have refineries. We're not going to take advantage of the fuel resources that we do have. And that is not a problem that the president of the United States has to say, well, yeah, because of that, we're going to accept this risk from Iran. So, and there are other countries as well that are in trouble. That is not entirely Donald Trump's fault. In fact, it probably isn't. Look at the Japanese. They've actually been prudent, and they have good storage facilities. They store fuel, and they're actually helping out some of their neighbors. So there is such a thing as responsible behavior by a national government. But there's some who've sort of assumed that the world would never have a serious war, serious disruption. But I would suggest that would think that within a couple months, that this will be resolved, and then we will go on to the next, whatever the next disaster is that we.
Well, it could be Oman, could be Cuba.
Could be. You never know. Or Putin makes a move on the Baltics. You really never quite know, but it's going to be something, and then you'll kind of forget that what you ever had going on with Iran. That's just sort of the way it is. But
I don't think we will, right? I think the economic disaster or the catastrophe that's looming, and it's already here, but it will get much worse. I think the economics of it will say that many people will suffer, and countries will suffer. And many have said, though, that regardless of whatever happens with the war in Iran, the world's changed. It's changed forever. Would you agree on that?
Oh, no, I think I've heard that sort of thing a lot, that now we're into a new era, everything's different. You've heard that how many times have you heard it? Remember .com, the .com boom, world's changed, everything's going to be digital. Nobody quite knew what that meant. And I think that the world is always, undergoing these sorts of difficulties, catastrophes, and, human tragedies. And it'll just, it will be something else if it isn't this one. One recalls, though, that, remember the end of history, Francis Fukuyama's statement after the Cold War, that there would never be wars again because democracies won, the liberal system won. You also saw that, remember during the start of the global war on terror, that it was only going to be insurgencies, the counterinsurgency. There would never be another major war. It was just unthinkable. Well, now we're on the verge of, having 3 or 4 at the same time. So I think that'll be something else. I don't think, to me at least, the human nature is what it is, and I'm not sure that it's all that different. It's just we're the ones having to live through it. You can imagine, our parents, Bataan falls and 12,000 Americans go into Japanese captivity. Just one disaster after another when it seemed like we were going to lose World War II. And these things happen. And, it's just you live through it and do the best you can. And hope that really the free nations, the civilized nations, that idea of sort of individual liberty and freedom kind of survives in the face of just the modern day version of the Mongolians coming over the eastern steppe. So to me, it isn't all that unusual. But It's nonetheless, when you're living through it, it's easy to, it's not so easy just to say, oh, just suck it up. And particularly when these are things that could have been avoided. And I would suggest that the Iran business, for example, if the pressure that had been applied, say, by the first Trump administration had been continued into the Biden administration, and if the Europeans had gotten involved and they'd put more pressure on the Chinese, that you could have had regime change. And that's really what we're talking about in Iran. And even in 2009 or so, during the Green Revolution, remember when Iranians went into the streets to protest a stolen election, that the Obama administration would not even put in a good word for the protesters. And you had Richard Armitage, really a Republican strategist and official, actually say, well, Iran's a democracy. They, even within the regime, they have to kind of talk to each other, and there's some sort of debate that goes on. We didn't do a thing, and just a word might have brought the thing down. And if you could imagine a world without, or a Middle East without Hezbollah, without Hamas, without the Houthis, without this apocalyptic, really brutal regime that, when they take in young women who've been caught protesting, the first thing, before they execute them, they rape them, because then they can't get into heaven. That's the kind of people we're dealing with. And that has nothing to do with Israel. It has everything to do with the nature of the Iranian regime. And, you can see what I think about all this, and I would hope that President Trump would see this through to the finish. And if we end up with a deal, well, it better be a really good one.
But if you don't end up with a deal, and we're not talking about Rhode Island here, we're talking about a very large country with many, many people, and they have they have access, and they have their own weapons of war. If you don't reach a deal, then this could become a never-ending war.
Oh, well, we've been at war with them from the beginning.
No, but
yeah, you could, but they have a lot less now than they did. And there's still a lot more military targets to go after. I'm surprised we haven't. I think it was a mistake to stop. And additionally, that dual-use infrastructure, the transportation system, but why is the communications, why is Iranian television still on the air? There's a lot more you can do to demonstrate and humiliate this coercive infrastructure that apparently 80% of Iranians don't support and would like it to disappear. That we haven't even, there's a lot more we could have done. And there's something a little McNamara-esque about the approach to Iran, the idea that we'll just use graduated pressure and we'll sort of bring them down with a sort of leverage, with a little bit of effort, instead of going after it all out and keeping the momentum going, and then putting that regime in a position where it really has no choice into what it's going to do. And sometimes not keeping the momentum going is a mistake that gets very hard to deal with. But there'll be if that regime continues, the situation will continue. They will still be at war with us, and all we've done is sort of slowed things down for a bit. And maybe that was worth it, maybe not. I would tend to think it's okay, but considering that you could have hit a grand slam instead of just a single, using baseball terms, that would leave a bad feeling in a lot of people's mouths, not least the Iranian public themselves, who were told, we're locked and loaded, liberation's at hand, come into the streets when time is right. That if they find at the end of the day, well, these guys are still in power, the Revolutionary Guards, the Basij, the militia, the intelligence, the police, that would be a little bit depressing, I would suggest, for them.
Depressing for the oppressor too, or the oppressors being the United States and also Israel. Look, we're just want to, because we're way over time, and I apologise, and I know it's late for you, but just look at Taiwan. Where are we at with Taiwan at the moment? That's another part of the world that could go just like that.
It could. I think the Chinese are going to hold off for a bit. They like the way domestic politics are developing in Taiwan, where the KMT main opposition is pretty much pro-China. Not all of it, but enough of it is. And I think that they might be able to have a KMT candidate win the presidency and at a minimum cause so much distraction and turbulence in in Taiwan that it's not able to defend itself very well, and it may just sort of roll over, possibly. And I think China's military has built up to the point that Xi Jinping might think that he has a reasonable chance of success if they go across the strait all out. But I think they're going to let the domestic situation play itself out. And then also, they're always watching very closely what things look like in America, Washington in particular. They're assessing the will and the ability of the U.S. to actually defend Taiwan. And we are really the guarantor, ultimately, of Taiwan's independence, effective independence. And they're watching that very closely. So if America, say, gets bogged down in in Iran, and it just becomes a political headache for the administration, in addition to having used up some of our arsenals, we've still got enough to give China a very bloody nose. But you could find that the political bandwidth, the political desire to get involved in another fight out in the Western Pacific might be such that China likes its odds. Or it might be so low that China likes its odds and really leaning on Taiwan. But for now, I don't see anything happening tomorrow. But in, say, 6 months, let's see what it looks like here.
And could the US, can they now rely on Japan? And also South Korea, can they rely on South Korea? Because I think our last conversation some time ago, you were casting some sort of doubt on the support from both South Korea and Japan for the US.
I'm not so sure about South Korea, just the nature of that leftist regime. But Japan, is almost as every day passes, Japan is more and more serious about its own defense. And that has really become the political consensus in Japan, that it needs a proper defense, proper military, to be able to defend Japan and its interests, and to be a better ally to the United States. It's a long way to go, or there's a ways to go, but it's very different than it was 5 years ago, or even just a few years ago. And with the Japanese on board, that makes things harder for the Chinese. But this is going to take some time to get just right. So I'm fairly optimistic about where us in Japan could actually get to, and that does help stabilize things when it's just not the United States sort of guaranteeing stability in the region. If it's Japan and the Philippines doing more than it's ever done for itself, Australia, I don't know. If they send up their Air Force, that would be very good. I'm not sure which of the 11 ships would be of a whole lot of help, but or even politically what they would actually do. But sometimes when it looks like some countries are going to get together to defend themselves, that people go along with it and bandwagon and realize where their interests are. So in some respects, it's like a lot of things. It's like a balance sheet. Some things look better than they did, and then that means some things look worse than they did. But I'm not too concerned right now about an all-out kinetic fight over Taiwan. But say give it some time, and we'll see. But it's the world's gotten obviously very interesting just in the last 5 months or so.
It has indeed. And I would dare say that the centerpiece of this attraction is your president. But anyway, as we move on, just by the way, our news have mentioned that Australia could very well house nuclear weapons on the request of the US. What's your thoughts on that, just quickly?
Oh, good. I see nothing wrong with it. There's obviously a political, psychological aspect to that as well. When you allow that to happen, it shows that you're accepting some risk. You understand the costs of it, and I think it's always a good thing. The Japanese, of course, and the Koreans, if they see Australians got them, well, you can guess what they're thinking. And at some point, I think this idea that America is going to provide all the nukes on demand, I think that those days are over and have been for some time. It's just taken a little time to get to this point. So I wouldn't have any problem at all with that. And once again, it does demonstrate, you're kind of choosing sides when you do that. You ask for that. And particularly the way, as I understand it, there's a part of the Australian political world that doesn't like nuclear, period. If an administration in Canberra is willing to take the heat, well, that would, it tells you something about where they at the end of the day where they think their interests lie.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we've got 16 fishing vessels at the moment for our Navy. We've got some very noisy submarines, and that's because we want to give the enemy a warning that we're coming towards them. You can probably see the puffs of smoke coming out of the chimneys. I'm being a bit cruel, but that's the harsh reality of our defence. In fact, the Chinese had a minor military operation or naval operation off the coast of Australia. And our defence was so magnificent, our defence capabilities and observations and surveillance were so great that we had to rely on I think it was a commercial aircraft that was flying from Sydney to New Zealand. And they looked down and said, hello, 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 there's some Chinese ships down there. So it does say that, yeah, we do need to up the ante a bit. I think we're too big for our population to go to the extent others would like us to, because we're just too big. But at least we do need to upgrade our military. The Labor Party have never had a great reputation when it comes to the Labor governments have never had a great reputation when it comes to updating military. In fact, we had a guy across the road who was under the previous Labor government. He was a commando, and they had to go bang, bang, bang. They had no blanks. And the winner out of the exercise could fire the one and only round out of a cannon. So, so I think we need to do more, and I think other countries need to do more. But I do worry about the push, though, to excessive militarism around the world, and I think we need to be very careful, because once a war begins, Grant, as you know, you cannot control it. It will go where it wants to go. My guest has been, I have to say, I've enjoyed your company very much, Colonel Grant Newsham, an old friend of ours, author of the book, When China Attacks, A Warning to America. Grant, if somebody wants to find out more about you or communicate, how would they do that?
You go to Center for Security Policy, it's in Washington, and just type in my name, and you'll see everything that I write or talk about. And on X, at Newsham Grant. So I'm pretty easy to find. So, always welcome attention.
Yeah, just one last thing. Someone said the other day that Americans view Washington of a 70, basically a circle of 70 miles, and then outside of that circle is reality. Would you agree?
Pretty much. And if you hang around Washington, you really understand that is the case. And that's why I encourage ambassadors and embassy officials to get out and talk to Americans. And that'll clear up a lot of things if you do that.
But I don't think Washington's unique. I think other, like in Canberra, the same thing with Canberra. No one visits their constituents really, and they've got no idea what's happening. And the same thing in the UK. You look at Starmer there; he has no idea what his constituents want. So I think it's a problem most countries have. But I thought it was quite funny that somebody mentioned that Washington, out of the 70 square mile radius, is reality. And I thought that's a pretty clever little saying. Grant, thank you so much for your time. And thanks for staying up too. I appreciate it very much.
We're today's News Talk, the world today.